Good morning. Thank you for being here today with us. My name is Sarah Audsley, and I'm the Writing Across Media Facilitator at Vermont Studio Center. Thank you for joining us today for our featured craft talk with virtual visiting writer Crystal Wilkinson. It's a special pleasure to have her here with us virtually, as she was also a resident writer here at VSC back in 2019. I always am really happy to bring writers back who have been in residence here and been working on their craft. And to have them come back in this way feels especially special. Crystal Wilkinson is the award-winning author of The Birds of Opulence, winner of the 2016 Ernest J. Gaines Prize for Literary Excellence, Water Street and Blackberries, nominated for both the Orange Prize and the Wright Legacy Award. She has received recognition from the Kentucky Foundation for Women, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Mary Anderson Center for the Arts, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and is a recipient of the Chaffin Award for Appalachian Literature. She has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and her short stories, poems, and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including most recently in the Oxford American and Southern Cultures. She currently serves at the University of Kentucky, where she is the Associate Professor of English in the MFA in Creative Writing program. Thank you, Crystal, for being with us, and I'm turning it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I know that you all probably have many reasons for being here, but I wrote in my notes, and I know it's true, I suspect that if you were drawn by the title of this craft talk, that either you think you can't do plot, or perhaps like me, you abhor plot first as a narrative strategy. So much of what we learn as fiction writers tells us that plot is paramount for fiction to be successful. And I'm proposing that plot is just not that important. Don't leave, but I'm proposing that plot is just not that important. But what is important is creating an illusion. I think that fiction is not meant to replicate real life, but to create the illusion of real life by extension. So I propose that if you worry about creating an illusion of movement in your story instead of worrying yourself about plot, then you'll accomplish the goal. So I wanted to pull up a PowerPoint. I never did PowerPoints before, but of course, this time of COVID, I've come to sort of rely on it since we're not there in person. So I wanted us to look at, if I can get it going here, some things that some writers have said about plot that some of them I agree with. Most of them I don't. Can you all see it? Okay. Character is plot, plot is character, F. Scott Fitzgerald said. Story is honorable and trustworthy. Plot is shifty and best kept under house arrest, Stephen King. I usually don't agree with Stephen King, but I agree with this one. But my philosophy is that plot advancement is not what the experience of reading fiction is about. If all we care about is advancing the plot, why read novels? We can just read Cliff Notes. George R.R. Martin. Agree with him too. Ray Bradbury says, remember, plot is no more than footprints left in the snow after your characters have run by on their way to incredible destinations. Plot is observed after the fact rather than before. It cannot precede action. It is the chart that remains when an action is through. That is all plot ever should be. It is human desire let run, running and reaching a goal. It cannot be mechanical. It can only be dynamic. So stand aside, forget targets, Let the characters your fingers, body, blood, and heart do. I realize I have too many of these, but I got carried away. M. Forster says, what the story does do, all it can do, is to transform us from readers into listeners, to whom a voice speaks, the voice of the tribal narrator, squatting in the middle of the cave and saying one thing after another until the audience falls asleep among their offal and bones. The story is primitive. It reaches back to the origins of literature before reading was discovered, and it appeals to what is primitive in us. That is why we are so unreasonable over the stories we like and so ready to bully those who like something else. Intolerance is the atmosphere stories generate. So some of these quotes are about narrative strategy and not just about plot. So that's part of what I'm sort of folding into all of this. It's a short quote, but the men had their own page, so I gave Eudora Welty her own space. A plot is 1,000 times more unsettling than an argument, which may be answered. Flannery O'Connor. Now, the second common characteristic of fiction follows from this, and it is that fiction is presented in such a way that the reader has the sense that it is unfolding around him. This doesn't mean he has to identify himself with the character or feel compassion for the character or anything like that. It just means that fiction has to be largely presented rather than reported. Another way to say it is that though fiction is a narrative art, it relies heavily on the element of drama. So one of the reasons why I'm presenting these quotes is for you to sort of sink in and begin to think about narrative strategy and the various ways. I see these quotes as sort of a continuum from sort of hardcore plot to some other narrative strategy. So that's what I want you to be thinking about as we go through. A couple more. Grace Paley, plot, the absolute line between 2 points, which I've always despised, not for literary reasons, but because it takes all hope away. Everyone, real or invented, deserves the open destiny of life. This one makes me cheer. Walter Mosley says, we must remember that there's more than one story and plot in every novel. There are at least as many stories as there are main characters, and each of these stories has to have multiple plots to keep it going. Blood and bone, nerve and tissue, forgotten, longing, and unknown events. And then I want to end this part with Ocean Vuong. I think that his book had a lot of controversy, and I think most people have either listened to him speak or have read some of his interviews, and you know what he was doing in One Earth I don't think I've got the title, but On Earth we're briefly beautiful. I think that's the right title. So what he did, and that has the same title as his poetry collection, but what he did is, he talks about it here. In Western narratology, the plot is the dominant mode to which all characters are subordinate. But I wanted a novel to hold these characters thoroughly, and most importantly, on their own terms, free from a system of governance, even one of my own making. I could not employ the plot-heavy strategy because I needed these people to exist as they are, full of stories, but not for a story. So I should have put the name in here. I probably copped out because I couldn't pronounce it, but there's a Chinese storytelling structure that he uses that insists that a narrative structure can survive and thrive on proximity alone, and proximity builds tension. So he, if you've read that novel, that's exactly what he does, is sort of put things beside one another. And part of that is what I'll be talking a little bit more about. So I think it comes down to these two things. This next one is really scary, so don't get frightened. Ta-da! So as fiction writers, we've been dealing with this thing our whole lives, right? This idea of this plot chart, this idea of having exposition and conflict and rising action, falling action, and resolution. So this is sort of our tradition in this part of the world, is the Western tradition, to write a story this way. So mainstream literary tradition says that this is the rule, that you have to have this. So if this is true, then if you have a quiet story, sometimes your story looks like this, right? So if you've got that sort of traditional plot arc, many of my stories look like this in the beginning, because I have a fondness for putting a character in a bathtub and have them think about their childhood, and they can do that for pages. I love it. I love sort of the psychology of a character. And then I collect all these bits and pieces, and then I look at it and try to figure out where and how I can instill some movement. So I wanted to talk about some of the ways that we can create the illusion of movement, which will give the reader the illusion that they started in one place and finished somewhere else. That's all you're trying to do, to start a reader in one place and move them somewhere else. And try to have some bumps in this line. So another quote, I love this quote by Mary Gordon that was in the introduction of Plowshares way back in 1997. So she says, the short story is usually only about one thing. The thing can be an object, a character, a moment. The thing can be any number of things, and the about can shape itself in any number of ways. The relationship of the one thing to the other things that surround it is precisely the short story's form. She goes on to say, the short story is like a wagon wheel. The spokes must be connected to the hub, or graceful movement is impossible. Or again, the short story is like a peacock's tail. At the center is a dense circle of color from which emanates the iridescent resonant shades that spread out to dazzle and delight. But the source of every tone must be the center, and the story will succeed or fail on its relationship to its center. So I love this narrative strategy much more than I love the Freytag triangle. So it's that elusive center, that wagon wheel hub, or whatever it is that we're writing, that thing in our stories that I'm talking about, placing the action on the page. So that's what I mean by putting your thing in action, which could be any number of things. Having our characters act out that thing on the page and do it in a way that gives our stories dramatic weight rather than traditional plot. So dramatic weight is kind of what I'm going to get to. And so I wanted to talk about verbs, really. And you might not think about verbs in terms of trying to get to dramatic weight, but it's everything. So I think we should remember as we go into this that I think the best fiction is made up of nouns and verbs and the occasional well-chosen adjective or adverb. I think it took me years to learn that, and I still covet adjectives and adverbs way too much, and I have to sort of pry them out of my early drafts. Clarity is not negotiable in fiction, and often we fail in our efforts for clarity because we don't take the most direct route through a sentence. by giving that sentence strong verbs and fluid construction. So that's where we're going to start first, with putting our thing in action, remembering that no action can happen in fiction without verbs. So we already know that there are passive verbs and there are active verbs. Verbs are strongest when they are precise and when they are concrete. Concrete is the quality of expressing a real movement. Strong verbs tell us exactly what is done in real action. Weaker verbs express less real-world action, and they gesture more toward a state of being, no action. And those weaker verbs should be used least often when writing fiction, and we'll get to a few exceptions to that rule a little later. So let's look at verb vigor. I'll go through, this is like your middle school lesson, but it's worth, I think, recounting. So doing verbs are the strongest: shot, walked, detonated, grinned. Sally, and I apologize for this early morning horror. Sally vomited on the floor. Saying verbs are the next strongest: said, ask, which are perfect for dialogue, almost never need shouted or whispered or inquired. I'm sick, Sally said. Thinking and feeling verbs are sort of intermediate. They happen in the character's mind. Sally felt sick. Being done to verbs are the next to the weakest. Verbs in passive voice. Character becomes sort of a victim. Sally was made sick by the lasagna. And then this is the absolute weakest, the being verbs. Sally was sick. So from strong verbs, you get strong sentences, and from strong sentences, you get strong scenes, and scenes are the building blocks of fiction. So let's take a look at some examples of these strong verbs, and I'll show you how all of this works in my mind. So maybe I won't get to all my examples. I probably should have given you all a handout, but they're on here. So this is told through the eyes of a small boy. This is a novel by James Steele. I don't know if you all have read it or heard of it. So it's told through the eyes of a small boy. Father looked down at me, standing there laughing with mother. Think I'll fotch this little dirty mouth along for ballast, he said. He reached down, pulling me into the saddle behind him, and I went up over the hindquarters limp with surprise, for father had never taken me along before. We rode off down the hill, but I did not look back for all my joy, knowing that Fletch's face was shriveled with jealousy, and knowing that I was 7 and this thing was as it should be. We went up Little Car Creek, the nag nervous with our unaccustomed weight, her flesh shivering at the touch of father's heels, and her hips working under me like enormous elbows. Her hind feet bedded in sand, and father clucked. She jumped, almost sliding me off. Clabe took the lead at the creek turn, reining his mount back and forth across the thin water. Keeping on firm ground, he rode far ahead. So in this passage, if you reduce the verbs down to their most simplest form, and I may have left some out. Oh, I guess I didn't put them in here. So if you, I didn't underline them on here, but they are fotch, which you have to be from my neck of the woods to know what fotch is, but it means to fetch. But look, fotch, reach, went, rode, shrivel, was, went, shiver, work, bed, cluck, jump, took, rain, took, keep, rode. So most of them are active, and you have the colloquial foch there, which I love. And then under still, sure hand, even when he uses was in this passage, it's important. We rode off down the hill, but I did not look back for all my joy, knowing that Fletch's face was shriveled with jealousy, and knowing that I was 7 and this thing was as it should be. So he reserves those passive verbs for that sort of emotional landscape at the end. Face was shriveled becomes a perfect choice for a verb, especially when it comes as a vehicle for that quiet, more passive and more poignant was 7. And I may not go through all of these. I need to watch my time. But I really get caught up in this when I'm doing it. But Barbara Kingsolver, I think, is one of the queens of active verbs. And you should notice this now in everything that you read, including your own work. It's not anything earth-shattering, but I'm just trying to plant some seeds to help you with your own work. So does someone else want to read this? Make you all do a little work. Do I have any volunteers? No? Okay.
Do you want me to read it, Crystal?
Sure.
Okay. As the ring burned smaller, we suddenly caught sight of its other side, the red-orange tongues and black ash closing in, the looming shapes of animals bunched up inside, antelopes, bushbucks, broad-headed warthogs with warthog children running beside them. A troop of baboons ran with arched tails flying as they zigzagged, not yet understanding their entrapment. Thousands of insects beat the air to a pulpy soup of animal panic. Birds hit the wall of fire and lit like bottle rockets. Oh, I love the sound of that sentence. Sorry. When it seemed there was no more air, no more hope, the animals began to run out through the fire into the open where spears and arrows waited. The antelope did not leap gracefully as I imagined they would. They wheeled like spooked horses around the inside of the circle, then suddenly veered out of it by accident or blindness. Seeing their companions shot in the neck with arrows, they heeled in panic, sometimes turning back to the flames, but mostly running straight toward people and death. A small spotted antelope fell down very near me and presented me with the strange, singular gift of its death. I watched its heaving side slowly come to rest, as if it had finally caught its breath. Dark blood leaked from its delicate black mouth onto the charred ground. For every animal struck down, there rose an equal and opposite cry of human jubilation. Our hungry wishbone cracked and ran slick with marrow. Women knelt with their knives to skin the meat, even before the hooves stopped beating the ground in panic.
Okay, so she's got all of that, and I couldn't really see it when I transferred it over, but if you look closely, you can see that I underlined the verbs burned, bunched, and the gerunds running, zigzagged, ran, you see them. And then, Sarah, if you read the last part of the passage.
Sure. The curtain of heat dived the will to survive from its survival itself. On account of these deaths, Kalinga's gleeful children would live through another season. Okay,
so examining something like this, you can see like the other part was you're sort of pummeled with these high verbs because of this action: veered, heeled, wheeled, presented, and all of those. And then when she gets toward the end, dived, and then she's got would live. So you have to note that would live is passive in regard to the structure of the language, but certainly a powerful and huge thing being acted out on the page after all of that all those verbs with that very active death. So she creates movement through the verbs. And let's look at one more. This is I'll just talk about the verbs. I won't read the whole passage, but this is a passage from Tanya James from a novel called Atlas of the Unknowns. So in this passage from Tanya, you may notice that the word accompanies is a more formal verb that's used, which fits the style used in conjunction with the rest of the novel. It also adds to what the passage is doing when you know that Lena has lost part of her arm to a fireworks accident, and also that she is an artist and that her mother has died. So the verbs that follow the action here: held, cut, bump, seem to spring, bend, pull, appear, pull, wait, groan, plunges, is blocked. And I think the is as a passive verb holds some weight here because it also adds a pause. Her sight is blocked, and as an artist, she wants to see more than anything. So that sort of adds to it. So the verbs are very strong in each of these passages, but it also might be helpful to you to assess your verbs and their dramatic weight. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So dramatic weight is a measurement of the actions that keep the reader leaning forward. I believe that dramatic weight is a playwriting term. And I think that dramatic weight can be looked at on a verb level. So we talked about weak and strong verbs. So if we were to assign numbers, if we were to assign weaker verbs an assessment number of 0 and stronger verbs an assessment number of, let's say, 10, then you have a range to work with. So it might look something like this. And I sort of made those up. So if we're saying that, again, passive verbs are 0 and active verbs are 10, it will be relative to your own work. But if we assign was a 0, then worry might be a 2, dance might be an 8, hurt might be a 7. And then again, you have to keep it relative to your narrative. Drop the keys would be a 2. Drop the baby would be a 9. And so I wanted to show you sort of what this will look like in my own work. I think we haven't talked about these passive verbs, and this is where some other power comes in, but think and remember, I think these are holy, and you can use those passive verbs to your great advantage in the work, or their opposites, don't remember or don't think. And I think that's all about psychological landscape, which is untapped territory, I think, in so many good manuscripts that I read. The difference between a good story and an excellent one is often the underuse of psychological landscape that again moves the reader from one place in the protagonist's psychology or their emotional landscape to another place. And these are sort of subtle movements. So the point is that you need this rise in variety in your work. So this is what I've done here is just taken these. So the way you would do this is that you would circle your verbs or highlight them in some way, and you would assign your verbs a number to take a look at that. And so verbs beget action, action begets scene. So then you could look at your scenes and actually assign your scenes a dramatic weight. So that's what this is. This is a list from one of my chapters in my novel. I don't even know if it ended up this way, but I always pull this one up and use it. So I've written here like what the primary action of the scene is, what characters are involved, and what the purpose of the scene. I don't have all of that in here, but that's what I would do. I want to stop here in just a second and address your questions. I think there may be some in the chat. AJ Verdell does this and puts it all in a spreadsheet. I'm not quite that numerically inclined, but if revision, I think this is especially a good revision tool. If revision is to see again, this is a way to see again your work and see what you're doing. So I assigned the scenes. I've got Mona and Yolanda meet at the diner where they meet once a year. Yolanda tells Mona about her panic attacks. The skinny waitress looks at Mona funny because she is not from here anymore. So I have a lot of twos in all my writing. Almost all my scenes are ones or twos. So I gave that a dramatic weight of a 2. The next one, Yolanda explains to Dr. Hamilton why Mona has always been her friend. The doctor nods as though he understands. Another 2. I write very quietly. And then the next one, it goes up a little bit and it's a 5. And the next one, I gave a dramatic weight of a 3. So again, you could do it in a spreadsheet and look at your whole novel or look at your whole story to see, kind of look at it and see what you're doing. And surprise, surprise, you could also sort of look at it in this way if you wanted to, and kind of come at it from the back. But the point is that not so much that it fits into sort of the traditional narrative, but you want variation when you're looking at the dramatic weight. You want it to vary. Like it would be just as bad, I think. I'm talking about the quiet story. But sometimes when I'm working with writers, I feel like I'm doing this because all their scenes are 6s. Like it's constantly like, whoa. But mostly it's the other way. And you have an entire scene after scene after scene where nothing happens that shows that there's any movement at all. So I want to talk about another concept after this and talk about beats of action a little bit, which is a concept. Well, I'll give you all some of the resources, but I want to stop the share and see if anybody has any questions or if you want to make any comments about that first part. I think David's the only face I can see, and I see him sort of nodding at times and making. So you all can feel free to turn.
I like this as a way of editing. It's very different from the usual kind of editing, but to look at a page and say, heavy, light, what did it add up to? I think I'll try that.
Good.
I have a question, Crystal. Can you hear me?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so, this quote, I have a fondness for putting a character in a bathtub and have them think about their childhood, and I could do this for pages, but I would read that novel. And I totally get that. So let me ask you about this concept of like elevating your verbs, varying your verbs for dramatic weight. In dialogue, let's say 2 characters are having a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. And so the difference between the verbs in the dialogue and the verbs in, like, if the character's walking around and waving her hands like I always do, what do you, does it work if you're looking at your verbs in the dialogue and what you're saying? It's hard to imagine action in dialogue is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't think you can, no, I don't think it works that way. It doesn't work in dialogue. The thing I would say about dialogue is that the litmus test for dialogue is what I call MIC, that the dialogue should move the story, inform the reader, and it should characterize. And if it's not doing at least 2 of those 3 things, then you might want to think about taking it out. So I have some rules about dialogue that keep me out of talky hell. That's what I call it when you get two characters and you just have them just sort of talking at each other constantly. That sort of gets out of that. Are there any comments or any questions in the chat? I can't.
Sorry, Crystal, I've been annotating a little bit what you've been saying and putting and notating.
Oh, okay. Good.
Some of your gems I've been dropping in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you.
There haven't been, there've just been some raving comments like that. This is really helpful for people's work.
Okay.
And
well, yeah. I want to sort of finish up then by talking about beats of action. So I'll go back to my little thing, and I have an exercise at the end, but I don't know if we'll have time to do it, but I can give it to you if there are writers interested in the exercise. So let me go back. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is beats of action, which is a film or playwriting term, another one that focuses on the physical movements of a character. So here's another, this is from Toni K. Bambara's The Survivor from Guerrilla, My Love. And let me see if I can move my thing here so I can see it. They're predicting 6 inches of snow by nightfall and gale winds besides, said the man next to her. He tapped the window and flakes of snow shifted patterns, then slid off the glass like rain. Jewel glanced unconcerned at the landscape rushing by. The trees looked as if something unnatural had been done to them. She replied, smoothed the book out again on what little lap left in the 9th month. But before she could recall what she was reading, her eyes slipped off the edge of the glossy page to drown in the shadows of her hip, then buoy up again and swivel onto the back of the worn seat in front of her, fastening onto a clump of frayed threads, beckoning, accusing with each bump of the bus. She shifted her weight, not so much to balance the baby as to juggle the mind's dangers, to ease the shouting in the head, lest it become a banging on the wall. Let me go mad, grandmother. Let me bleed and forever lost and no one. The bus rushing through the whitened country to the old woman who could dispel the incubus devouring her with a simple laying on of hands. Hope we make it to town before it starts gusting, said the man, offering a stick of gum. Jewel slid her eyes deep back in their sockets and played dead. So this is beautiful writing, and one of my favorite writers, Toni K. Bambara, and this is not a judgment, but when you look, the beats of action also has to do with what the character is doing, what the character is physically doing and where the character is. So if you're a language whore, like I am, like I love beautiful language, and I could live in it, and I luxuriate in it. That's part of the being in the tub. It's just like I love language and making things pretty, but when I go back and look, I realize that I have not put the character in their body, and they're not currently present in their body doing things. And so I think, and that's not to say that she's not doing that. She really is, but there's this beauty in the writing. But when you distill it down, these would be, make my thing move here. These would be her beats of action in that passage. So it follows the characters. Man speaks to her of snow. Man taps at snow on the window. Jewel looks out the window and replies with a sigh. She smooths out her book. She looks down and shifts her weight. And I may have missed some, but I wanted you to see how that works. She rolls her eyes back. So this is another way to create movement in your work, is to like distill it. You don't have to take everything out, but make sure you can follow sort of the physicality of your character through a scene, that you've paid attention to where they are physically and what they're doing, where their body is and what they're doing with their body through the scene. And I have those other two with the man because she's interacting with another character, but really the core beats of action are those last four. And when you look, the sun is shining, so I can't go back. But when you look at that passage, can't see my little cursor, but when you go back, you can't, to that passage, you wouldn't necessarily pluck those things out, but that's what makes you lean forward as a reader. Whether you know that or not, like she has that, all those other things around it, but that's the core. We're following Jewel. We want to know what Jewel is doing, and we're able to follow her because we can see her physically, and she's physically doing these things. So I think even if the beats of action in a scene are nested in a dense scene with description or reflection, that they are the things that lead the reader through the passage. And I think that also addresses your task, which one of your tasks in a scene is to make something happen, even if it's something quiet. And so I think both dramatic weight and beats of action are ways in which you can do that. And so I think I won't do the exercise yet. I want to see if you all have other questions or comments, or what might even be more helpful is for you and those of you all that don't necessarily want to put your face on, you can at least turn your mics on and ask a question. Maybe you have a question about your own work, or how you would incorporate these ideas into your own work.
I'm going to ask a question, Crystal. This is incredibly helpful, especially for a stage I'm at with my novel, which is 2.5 drafts in. Have you gotten to the point, do you think, where you kind of, this comes about intuitively on the first draft, or are these more revision editing tools in your mind?
I think that they do, so part of doing this, particularly with the verbs, you're sort of teaching yourself. And it becomes sort of an internal rhythm, and you don't have to do it as much. But I always do it when I've written fiction. I go back. Sometimes the form, like the story I read last night, I'm not so sure that these techniques would work because it's another sort of weird thing in itself. But for my quiet work, which is always quiet, if I've worked on a story and I've sent it out and no one's taking it, and I'm looking at it and I realize it's really quiet, I'll go back and do these steps. And then sometimes it's just a matter of moving scenes around to create that illusion. So I have one scene sort of buried in there where something happens that's engaging to a reader, or might be engaging to an editor, but I've buried it. So sometimes I can make decisions about moving scenes around or take other quiet scenes away from it so that it stands out more. Mm-hmm. So mostly I use it as a revision tool, but I think being in the habit of doing it definitely helps train you to sort of do it organically. And I think doing things like this, little small things with your work, also does something for you, for your psychology as a writer, because often we have days where we don't feel like a writer, right? We're just like, I should be working. But taking a highlighter or even highlighting something on your computer is something that you can do sort of mindlessly that will forward your work when you go back and you analyze it. So you don't have to be like deep in your manuscript every time. You can sit somewhere and drink coffee, or sometimes even talk to people, and you can say, oh, highlight your verbs and then come back and analyze it later. So I think it's a good tool. And the same with beats of action. If you are looking at your scenes and you're sort of listing the beats of action, then you can do the same thing. I think one of the things I didn't put up on the screen is that the beats of action, and she talks about the basics, is from a book called The Scene Book, a primer for The Scene Book, a primer for fiction by Sandra Schofield. And I think I'm not huge on craft books, but I think that's a good one to have. She breaks things down into increments like that, so you can really look at them.
Crystal, there was a question from the chat
Okay.
from Erica Williams, and she says, this is very helpful. Do you have any advice for writing flash fiction? And I think that, what I really appreciate about your craft talk is that looking at your verbs is helpful no matter what genre you're working in.
It's true.
But flash fiction is its own little beast. And I was wondering if
So flash fiction, I think you can do the same thing, just to sort of analyze what you're doing. Just, you won't be using necessarily the full elements of scene. So instead of looking at an isolated 3 to 5 pages that you might have in a scene in a novel or a short story, you're looking at smaller increments. So you're looking to sort of draw a line where there's some movement in the story, which in essence is scene. And, like Sarah said, you could also use it if you're writing poetry. You can look at your stanzas and see what you're doing. But even in flash fiction, it's going to help you if you look at your verbs and you sort of highlight your verbs to see where the movement is in the piece. Because sometimes if something's not working, or if it's not, publishing isn't everybody's goal, but if it's not being picked up, or if you don't feel quite right about it, you can look at look at your verbs and sort of enhance them, or reduce the verbs down to their most basic form. Sometimes you're hiding those verbs. You can do this with getting rid of your too many adjectives or adverbs.
Yeah,
there's another way.
Crystal, there was a question that was directly messaged to me in the chat from Evelyn, who is a VSC alum. And she was wondering, could you talk about the role that adverbs and adjectives do play? And I guess it is, from a revision standpoint, like looking at the verbs is like definitely maybe our first step as in revising. But when do you look at the adjectives and adverbs? And is it because we have a tendency as writers to rely too heavily on them instead of looking at our verbs?
Yeah, I think we do rely too heavily on them, because I think that it's not that any part of language should be dismissed. It's all about balance, and I think that the best writing comes from strong nouns and strong verbs, and the occasional well-chosen adjective or even adverb, because you don't need to say the blue old, however many plaid soft chair, or he sat in the blue old plaid soft chair. But I think if you have something that where you can choose an adjective that gives the sentence some power, that gives what's that French term? Here I am being Appalachian trying to speak French, but Le mot juste. So the perfect word. You want to make sure that those adjectives are the perfect word that you have before your powerful noun and your powerful verb. And I think often fiction writers don't think about, we think about those big things. We think about plot and we think about scene, but often we don't work on our sentences or on a line level the way that poets do. And I think that that's important for us to do as well. I mean, in my last novel, I even counted syllables in some of the sentences because I realized that, I revised that novel like I would a poem. And I read the sentences out loud and tried to make sure that they all had a rhythm, and les mots justes was important to try to get the perfect word and the way the word sounded. And I think fiction writers sometimes don't think about that. Like we don't think about, maybe we do as far as character is concerned, but we don't often think about the sound, like the sound between booze and whiskey. And that's a poet's sort of approach. We don't think about that, but I think it's important for us as well. Mary, you were going to ask something else?
Yes, thanks. Okay, so when we're looking at our chapters and we're trying to elevate and vary our verbs, right? I understand that what a character says in dialogue is just kind of what a character says. Characters don't necessarily elevate their verbs.
Mm-hmm.
But in those bathtub scenes, those introspective scenes, how are we going to elevate our verbs? I mean, maybe there's a remembering of a scene in those introspectives, and that scene itself, it can be. But do you have any advice about when we're looking at our chapters and we're looking at our verbs in everything but dialogue? You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Have you, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what you're saying, but I think that sometimes depending on, it's all, I don't have your novel in front of me, but I think you look for patterns. You look for your own patterns. And then you also think, I mean, if you're dealing with flashbacks and you're dealing with memory, you want to elevate that to being holy, right? You want to make sure that the memories you bring forth for a character also have dramatic weight. So you might not look at the verbs, but you're looking at the memory overall, and you're saying, is this memory important? Is this a spoke on the wheel that points to the core of what I'm doing? Or can I choose another memory for this character that would be much more powerful?
Thank you. And I just as a follow-up, just because I'm such a language whore myself, what about this idea of making sure you keep coming back to the body is so important. That's so good. But when you come back to the body, you immediately think adjectives and adverbs for some reason. So verbs coming back to the body to do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I'm talking about things like remembering, like sometimes we get to writing, and especially if we're our language whores, we're just sort of floating along and we've got all these wonderful passages, but there's no, the characters at their table, and we have no actions. Like you think about, you have to want to make sure that your character is doing something. It doesn't have to be like dun 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 sword fight, but that they're in their body, that they feel the warmth from their coffee cup, that they take it to their lips, that they hear, that you have sensory details that are sort of attached to their body and not just sort of floating language all the way through. That at some time you come back to the body, even if it's a sigh or it's a whatever it is, something that gives the character some subtle actions that reminds the reader, oh, this is a person that has a body. I'm not just sort of floating in this language. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This is great.
Thank you.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Are there any last minute burning questions for Crystal?
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm glad you came to be with me this morning. I know that it's early all over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Crystal. And what I really appreciate about your craft talk is kind of, you know, stealing or actually I think there was a comment, if you want to drop in the exercise in the chat.
Oh,
some people might want that for
it was a really sure, I'll put it in there. It was a really simple, it's a simple one if I can find it here. Yeah, I'll put it in there.
Sure. And then what I wanted to say to everyone is that what I appreciate about Crystal's craft talk discussion this morning is that she's smart and she's stealing from other genre techniques, like beats and action, pauses and beats and action is actually taken from drama, and dramatic weight, and thinking about those. And also I really loved how, you know, she's inviting us to come up with our own scale, our own Richter scale for what we think dramatic weight could be in our work. And also inviting us to think about different ways to revise our work, feels really, really helpful. And so, yeah, the writing prompt that she was inviting us is dropped into the chat, and I'm gonna hold that open for a while so you can grab that. And Crystal, thank you so much. I really appreciate your talk this morning, and also inviting us to think about ways to look at our work and on the sentence level, and that it can be applied to people working in different genres on different projects.
Yeah, we didn't talk about nonfiction, but it can also apply to nonfiction as well.
Yeah.